Bear cub found. Sleeping in a toddler's crib, what the parents did next was truly shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning sunlight filtered through the pine trees surrounding the Marshall family's cabin, casting dappled shadows across the wooden porch. Isla Marshall stirred in her bed, her eyes fluttering open to the gentle sounds of birds chirping outside her window. The cabin had been their weekend retreat for years, but 6 months ago, she and her husband Noah had decided to make it their permanent home after the birth of their daughter, Emma. Hila stretched her arms above her head, savoring the peaceful quiet of early morning. Noah was still asleep beside her, his chest rising and falling with deep, even breaths. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. The wooden floor was cool beneath her bare feet as she padded across the room. "Time to check on my little angel," she whispered to herself, a smile playing on her lips. The hallway was dimly lit, with family photos lining the walls, memories of hikes through the surrounding forest, picnics by the nearby lake, and Emma's first smile. Isla paused at the slightly ajar door to her daughter's nursery, listening for any sounds of movement. Strange, she thought. Usually Emma would be awake by now, babbling or playing with her stuffed animals. Pushing the door open, Isla felt a cool breeze brush against her face. Her heart skipped a beat when she noticed the window was cracked open. They always kept it locked at night. Her gaze darted to Emma's crib, and the sight before her made her blood run cold. There, nestled beside her peacefully sleeping 2-year-old daughter, was a small, furry creature with rounded ears and a black button nose. A bear cub. Its dark brown fur contrasted sharply against Emma's pale pink blanket, rising and falling with each small breath it took. Isla's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that threatened to escape. Her maternal instinct screamed at her to rush forward and snatch Emma away, but fear kept her frozen in place. The bear cub was sound asleep, one tiny paw draped over Emma's stomach, almost protectively. "Noah," she whispered urgently, not daring to take her eyes off the surreal scene before her. When no response came, she backed slowly into the hallway. "Noah!" she called again, louder this time, her voice cracking with panic. Seconds later, Noah appeared in the hallway, his hair disheveled from sleep, his eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert at the sound of distress in his wife's voice. There's a bear cub," Isla stammered, pointing toward Emma's room. "In her crib, with her, right now." Noah's expression shifted from concern to disbelief. "What? That's impossible." "See for yourself," Isla whispered, her hand trembling as she gripped his arm. Together, they crept back to the doorway of Emma's nursery. Noah's sharp intake of breath confirmed that Isla wasn't hallucinating. The bear cub was real, and it was sleeping peacefully next to their daughter. "How did it get in?" Noah whispered, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the partially open window. "The window," Isla replied, her voice barely audible. "But Noah, where's the mother bear? If she's looking for her cub..." The thought hung heavy in the air between them. A mother bear searching for her cub could be incredibly dangerous, especially if she thought humans had taken her baby. As if sensing their presence, Emma stirred in her crib. Her eyes opened slowly, and instead of screaming or crying at the sight of her unusual bedmate, she smiled. Her small hand reached out to touch the cub's fur, and to Isla and Noah's astonishment, the cub responded with a gentle nuzzle against Emma's cheek. "Bear," Emma said simply, her voice filled with delight as she patted the cub's head. "Nice bear." The cub yawned, revealing tiny white teeth, but showed no signs of aggression. It seemed just as comfortable with Emma as she was with it. "What do we do?" Isla whispered, her eyes never leaving the crib. Part of her was terrified, but another part was captivated by the strangely tender scene unfolding before them. Noah ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "We need to get Emma away from it, slowly. Then we can figure out what to do with the cub. But what if it gets scared? What if it hurts her? And what about the mother bear?" Isla's questions tumbled out, each one laced with increasing fear. Before Noah could respond, they heard a faint whimpering sound. The cub was now fully awake, its dark eyes looking around the room with what appeared to be confusion and perhaps fear. It nudged closer to Emma, who wrapped her small arms around it as if trying to comfort it. "I think it's scared," Noah observed, his voice softening. "It's just a baby, lost and looking for warmth and safety." As they watched, Emma reached for her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear, and offered it to the cub. The cub sniffed at it curiously but seemed more interested in Emma's gentle pats. "Bear hungry?" Emma asked, looking up at her parents with innocent eyes that showed no comprehension of the danger. In that moment, something shifted in Isla's heart. The fear was still there, but now mixed with a strange sense of wonder. This wild creature, this baby bear, was behaving more like a lost puppy than a dangerous predator. "We need to call someone," she said finally. "Wildlife Services or a ranger, someone who knows what to do." Noah nodded, but neither of them moved, both transfixed by the unlikely bond forming between their daughter and the bear cub in the soft morning light streaming through the window. Outside, the forest remained quiet, giving no indication of a distressed mother bear searching for her lost cub. But they knew that peace might not last long. They had to act quickly, yet carefully. What they would do next would shock everyone who would later hear their story, a story about an unexpected visitor that would change their lives forever. Noah took a deep breath and carefully approached the crib. Emma looked up at him with trusting eyes, still patting the cub's head. "Daddy, look, bear friend," she said proudly. "Yes, sweetie, I see," Noah replied, his voice deliberately calm despite the hammering of his heart against his ribs. "Can Daddy pick you up for breakfast?" Emma frowned, her bottom lip jutting out. "Bear, too." Noah exchanged a glance with Isla, who stood frozen in the doorway. "We'll see about your new friend," he said carefully. As Noah reached into the crib, the cub let out a soft whine and pressed closer to Emma. Noah paused, his hands inches away from his daughter. The cub wasn't showing aggression, but its behavior suggested it was frightened. "Wait," Isla whispered, stepping forward. "Let me try." She moved beside Noah and knelt by the crib, bringing herself to eye level with Emma and the cub. "Hi there, little one," she said softly, addressing the cub. "You must be lost, aren't you?" The cub's dark eyes studied her, alert but not aggressive. Isla slowly extended her hand, palm up, staying just outside the crib bars. "It's okay, we won't hurt you." To their amazement, the cub stretched its neck forward and sniffed Isla's fingers. Its nose was wet and cold against her skin. "Noah," Isla whispered, "look at its paw." Noah leaned closer and noticed what had caught Isla's attention. The cub's front right paw was swollen, with a small thorn visibly embedded in the pad. "It's hurt," he said, understanding dawning on his face. That might be why it came in through the window, looking for shelter. Emma had noticed too. "Oi," she said, pointing to the cub's injured paw. "Kiss better?" She leaned down as if to kiss the paw, but Noah gently held her back. "No, sweetie, we need to be careful with wild animals, even baby ones." Isla stood up decisively. "I'm calling doctor. Whitaker. Noah looked at her in surprise. The vet? Isla, we should call Wildlife Services. Isla shook her head. Dr. Whitaker worked with the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center before moving here. She'll know what to do, and she's just down the road. Wildlife Services would take hours to get here from the city. While Isla went to make the call, Noah sat on the floor beside the crib, watching Emma and the cub with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Emma was now showing her picture books to the cub, turning pages and pointing to images as if reading to it. "Bear likes story," she declared, beaming at Noah. "I think Bear does," Noah agreed, unable to suppress a smile despite the bizarre situation. The cub had relaxed a bit, though it still flinched whenever it accidentally put weight on its injured paw. It seemed remarkably comfortable with Emma, occasionally sniffing her hair or nuzzling against her arm. Isla returned 5 minutes later, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "Helen's coming right away. She says to keep both Emma and the cub calm and not to separate them unless the cub shows signs of stress." "Not separate them?" Noah asked incredulously. "Isla, that's a wild animal." "A scared, injured baby wild animal," Isla corrected him. "Helen says cubs this young are actually quite adaptable and aren't aggressive unless threatened." She hesitated. "There's something else. There was a report yesterday about a female bear found dead about 2 miles from here, hit by a car on the highway." Noah's expression softened immediately. "You think it's the mother?" "Helen says it's possible. The bear had been nursing." They both looked at the cub with new understanding, not just lost, but orphaned. The next 30 minutes passed in a strange, dreamlike state. They brought water in a shallow dish, which the cub lapped at cautiously. Emma insisted on having her breakfast of banana slices and cereal in the crib with Bear, as she had simply named her new friend. To their surprise, the cub showed interest in the banana, and Noah carefully handed small pieces to Emma, who then offered them to the cub. When the doorbell rang, both Isla and Noah jumped. The cub, startled by the unfamiliar sound, pressed against Emma, who patted its head reassuringly. "It's okay, Bear, doorbell," she explained, as if the cub could understand her. Dr. Helen Whitaker was a tall woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried a large medical bag and wore an expression that suggested nothing could surprise her anymore. "Well," she said after Isla and Noah had ushered her into Emma's room, "this is certainly a first." She approached the crib slowly, her experienced eyes assessing the situation. "Hello, Emma. And who's your friend?" "Bear," Emma replied simply, hugging the cub protectively. Dr. Whitaker nodded as if this was a perfectly normal introduction. "May I see Bear's paw, Emma? I heard there's an OE that needs fixing." Emma nodded solemnly and gently lifted the cub's injured paw for inspection. The cub, remarkably, allowed this handling, though it watched Dr. Whitaker warily. "Good girl," Dr. Whitaker praised, then looked up at Isla and Noah. "Both of them, actually. This level of trust is extraordinary." She set her bag down and opened it, revealing medical supplies. "I'm going to need to remove that thorn and clean the wound. The cub might become agitated." "Should we take Emma out?" Isla asked, tensing. Dr. Whitaker considered this. "Actually, the cub seems calmer with her. If you're comfortable with it, I think Emma's presence might make this easier." Noah and Isla exchanged concerned glances but nodded their agreement. "Emma, doctor." "Whitaker's going to help Bear's OE," Isla explained. "Can you be a big girl and help keep Bear calm?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I help Bear." What happened next would have seemed impossible had they not witnessed it themselves. As Dr. Whitaker carefully extracted the thorn from the cub's paw, Emma stroked its head and sang a simple lullaby that Isla often sang to her at bedtime. The cub whimpered once when the thorn came out but remained surprisingly still, its eyes fixed on Emma's face. "There we go, Doctor," Whitaker said, applying a disinfectant to the wound. "The swelling should go down in a day or two." She sat back on her heels and studied the cub thoughtfully. "It's a female, about 3 months old, and based on her condition, I'd say she hasn't been without her mother for long. She's well nourished." "What happens now?" Noah asked. "Will Wildlife Services take her?" Dr. Whitaker packed up her supplies with practiced efficiency. "That's usually the protocol, yes, but there's a complication. The rehabilitation center in the city is overwhelmed right now," she explained. "Spring brings a surge of orphaned wildlife, and they're at capacity. Even if they could take her, she would be heavily sedated for transport and kept in a small enclosure due to space limitations." She hesitated. "It's not ideal for a cub this young. The stress alone could compromise her health." "So, what options does that leave?" Isla asked, a strange feeling stirring in her chest as she watched Emma and the cub, who had both fallen asleep in the crib, exhausted by the morning's excitement. Dr. Whitaker's next words would set in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever. "I have a rather unorthodox proposal," she said, her voice low and serious. "One that would require extraordinary commitment from both of you." Noah and Isla leaned forward, listening intently as the vet outlined a plan so unusual, so unprecedented, that no one in their small mountain community would believe it at first. A plan that would soon make headlines across the country and spark fierce debates about the boundaries between humans and wildlife. Outside the window, a stray beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating Emma and the bear cub sleeping peacefully together, unaware that their unlikely friendship had just become the catalyst for something remarkable. The following morning, Isla awoke to the sound of giggling coming from Emma's room. For a moment, the events of the previous day seemed like a dream, until she remembered the bear cub. She bolted upright, startling Noah awake beside her. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Emma," Isla said, already getting out of bed. "She's with the cub." They had set up a makeshift enclosure in the corner of Emma's room the night before, a large dog crate padded with blankets. Dr. Whitaker had helped them settle the cub inside before leaving with promises to return later with supplies and more detailed instructions. Emma had been reluctant to be separated from Bear, but had eventually fallen asleep in her own crib after extracting solemn promises that the cub would still be there in the morning. Now, as Isla and Noah hurried to Emma's room, they were unprepared for the sight that greeted them. The door of the dog crate was open, and Emma sat on the floor with the bear cub, rolling a small ball between them. The cub batted at it with her good paw, sending it back to Emma, who laughed with delight. "Emma Rose Marshall," Noah said, his voice tight with alarm. "How did you get Bear out of her crate?" Emma looked up innocently. Bear sat, door open. She demonstrated with her small fingers how she had apparently figured out the latch mechanism. Isla knelt down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Emma, sweetheart, Bear needs to stay in her special house. Remember what Dr. Whitaker said?" But as she reached to pick up Emma, Isla paused. The cub wasn't showing any signs of aggression. In fact, she seemed completely at ease, rolling onto her back as Emma gently rubbed her belly. "This is—" Noah struggled for words. "Unprecedented." A knock at the front door interrupted the surreal domestic scene. Dr. Whitaker had returned as promised, this time accompanied by a man Isla and Noah didn't recognize. "This is Dr. Marcus Chen," Helen introduced after they had ushered their visitors inside. "He's a wildlife behaviorist from the university. I thought his expertise might be valuable given the unusual circumstances." Dr. Chen was a slender man with thoughtful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He nodded politely. "Dr. Whitaker has briefed me on the situation. I must say I'm intrigued." When they entered Emma's room, Dr. Chen stopped short, his professional composure momentarily slipping. "They're playing together," he said, watching as Emma and the cub continued their game with the ball. "Is that normal?" Noah asked. "No," Dr. Chen replied frankly. "It's extraordinary. Bear cubs, even orphaned ones, typically maintain a healthy fear of humans. This level of comfort suggests—" He trailed off, observing the interaction with scientific curiosity. "Suggests what?" Isla prompted. Dr. Chen hesitated. "I'd need to observe them more, but my initial impression is that this cub may have been exposed to humans before, perhaps even partially socialized." This revelation added a new layer of mystery to an already bizarre situation. If the cub had previous human contact, where had it come from? And how had it ended up alone in the forest near their cabin? As the adults talked, Emma had grown bored with the ball game. She was now reading a picture book to the cub, who lay beside her attentively. "And then the butterfly found his mommy," Emma narrated in her toddler's syntax, pointing to colorful illustrations. The cub watched, occasionally nudging the page with her nose. Dr. Chen knelt down at a respectful distance. "May I join you, Emma?" he asked gently. Emma looked up, considering the stranger. "Okay," she finally agreed. "We reading butterfly book." "I see that," Dr. Chen smiled. "Does Bear like the story?" Emma nodded emphatically. "Bear's sad about her mommy, like Butterfly." The adults exchanged glances. Even at 2 years old, Emma had somehow intuited the cub's orphaned status. "What would you think, Emma?" Dr. Chen asked carefully. "If Bear stayed with you for a little while? Until we can find her a good home?" Emma's face lit up. "Bear stay, forever and ever." Dr. Chen laughed softly, then turned to Isla and Noah with a more serious expression. "We need to discuss the logistics if you're willing to consider what Dr. Whitaker proposed." The unorthodox proposal that Helen Whitaker had outlined the previous day involved Noah and Isla temporarily fostering the cub under strict professional supervision until a suitable permanent solution could be found. It wasn't fostering a wild animal that made the plan shocking. It was the suggestion that Emma's extraordinary bond with the cub could be carefully maintained during this period, under controlled conditions and with extensive safety protocols. "I understand your reservations, Doctor," Chen said as they sat in the living room. The door to Emma's room left ajar so they could monitor the ongoing play session. "And in most cases, I would never recommend something like this. But the circumstances here are unique." He explained that separating the cub from Emma abruptly could cause significant stress to the already traumatized young animal. More importantly, the unusual relationship developing between them offered a rare opportunity to study interspecies communication and bonding, research that could ultimately benefit wildlife conservation efforts. "With your permission," he continued, "I'd like to document their interactions. It could provide valuable insights into early cognitive development in bears, as well as cross-species empathy in young children." Noah ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with the decision. "This seems incredibly risky." "It is, Doctor," Chen acknowledged honestly. "Which is why the protocols would be extensive. The cub would never be left alone with Emma. You would receive training in bear behavior and safety, We would install secure barriers that could be activated instantly if needed. Isla, who had been quiet during much of the discussion, finally spoke. What happens to the cub in the long term? She can't stay with us forever. Dr. Whitaker nodded. The goal would be to eventually transition her to a sanctuary where she could live as naturally as possible. This temporary arrangement would give us time to find the right place and prepare her for that transition. As they debated the merits and risks of this unprecedented plan, a shout from Emma's room sent them all rushing back. "Bear, catch!" Emma was giggling as the cub stood on her hind legs, reaching for a stuffed toy that Emma held just out of reach. It was a playful game, but the sight of the cub standing, revealing just how large she already was compared to Emma, made Noah and Isla freeze. Dr. Chen watched with professional interest. Her injured paw is already bearing weight. That's a good sign. The cub dropped back to all fours and made a soft huffing sound that almost resembled a laugh. Emma responded by making the same noise back, which seemed to delight the cub, who repeated it. "They're communicating," Isla whispered, amazed. Dr. Chen nodded. Children and young animals often find ways to connect that transcend conventional language. It's fascinating to observe. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep in her crib and the cub was securely back in her enclosure, Isla and Noah sat at their kitchen table, faced with the most unusual decision of their lives. "Are we really considering this?" Noah asked, his voice low. "Keeping a bear cub in our house?" Isla looked down at the detailed documents Dr. Chen and Dr. Whitaker had left. Protocols, safety measures, legal considerations. It was overwhelming. "It would only be temporary," she reminded him, "and they'd be here to help every step of the way." Noah sighed. "It's just so unbelievable. A month ago, our biggest concern was whether Emma was ready to transition from a crib to a toddler bed." Isla reached across the table and took his hand. "I know it sounds crazy, but you've seen them together. There's something special happening there." They were interrupted by a sudden crack of thunder that shook the windows. Within moments, they heard Emma crying, startled awake by the storm. As they hurried to her room, they were met with an unexpected sight. The cub was whimpering too, pressing against the bars of her enclosure, clearly distressed by the thunder. Emma had climbed out of her crib, something she'd never done before, and was trying to reach the cub's enclosure. "Bear's scared," she explained tearfully when she saw her parents. "Need hug." Isla and Noah exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Then, moving carefully, Noah lifted Emma while Isla opened the enclosure just enough to stroke the cub's head soothingly. "It's okay," Isla murmured to both distressed little ones. "Just thunder. You're safe." As the storm raged outside, the marshals formed a small circle of comfort in the dimly lit room, Noah holding Emma, who reached out to touch the cub, while Isla gently reassured the frightened animal. It was in this moment, this tableau of unexpected tenderness between species, that their decision was made. Their lives were about to change in ways they could never have imagined. The story of Emma and her bear cub would soon spread beyond their small mountain community, bringing both wonder and controversy to their doorstep. But for now, in the quiet bubble of that storm-swept night, all that mattered was soothing two young creatures who had found comfort in each other's presence. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, bending them like dancers in the darkness. But inside the cabin, a new kind of family was taking shape, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between humans and wildlife. The next morning arrived with the fresh, clean scent that follows a heavy rain. Isla stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching droplets of water sparkle on the pine needles as the rising sun touched them. The events of the previous day and night still seemed dreamlike, but the reality of their decision was beginning to sink in. They had agreed to Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Chen's proposal. For the next few weeks at least, they would be fostering a bear cub, under strict supervision and with extensive safety protocols. The researchers would return later that day to begin setting up the necessary equipment and training them on proper procedures. "You're up early," Noah said, coming into the kitchen and wrapping his arms around her from behind. Isla leaned back against him. "Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about what we've gotten ourselves into." "Having second thoughts?" Noah asked, his chin resting on her shoulder. Isla shook her head slowly. "No, actually, it's strange, but after seeing them together during the storm, it feels right somehow." She turned in his arms to face him. "Am I crazy?" Noah smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "If you are, then I am too, because I feel the same way." A soft thump from Emma's room caught their attention. They found their daughter already awake, sitting on the floor beside the cub's enclosure, pushing small pieces of her breakfast banana through the bars. The cub was accepting them gently, licking Emma's fingers in the process. "Good morning, nature girl," Noah said, kneeling down beside Emma. "I see you're sharing your breakfast." Emma nodded seriously. "Bear hungry." "Her name can't just be Bear, you know," Isla said, joining them. "She needs a proper name, like you have Emma." Emma considered this important matter, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Rosie," she finally declared. "Like my middle name." "Rosie," Noah repeated, watching as the cub responded to Emma's voice. "I think it suits her." By mid-morning, Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Chen had returned, this time with a truck full of equipment. What followed was a flurry of activity as they transformed the marshal's cabin to accommodate their unusual new resident. A secure outdoor enclosure was constructed off the back porch, large enough for the cub to exercise but completely escape-proof. Inside, Emma's room was modified with a larger, more comfortable enclosure for nighttime and any periods when direct supervision wasn't possible. Safety barriers were installed throughout the house, capable of creating instant separation if needed. Dr. Chen set up discrete cameras to document the interactions between Emma and the newly named Rosie. "We'll review the footage daily," he explained. "It will help us understand their communication patterns and ensure everything remains safe." As the day progressed, the cabin filled with more visitors, a veterinary assistant bringing specialized food, formulated for orphaned bear cubs, a carpenter to reinforce certain areas of the house, and finally, much to Noah and Isla's dismay, a local wildlife officer. Officer Jameson was stern-faced and disapproving as he reviewed the special permits that Dr. Chen had expedited. "This is highly irregular," he stated, flipping through the paperwork. "Keeping a wild animal in a residential setting, especially with a small child present. The circumstances are exceptional, Doctor," Chen explained patiently. "And every possible safety measure has been implemented." "Still," Officer Jameson persisted, "if word gets out about this arrangement, it could encourage others to attempt to domesticate wildlife." Dr. Whitaker stepped forward. "Which is why confidentiality is a key component of our agreement. This is a controlled research study, not an attempt at domestication." The officer remained skeptical but eventually signed off on the temporary arrangement, with the caveat that he would be conducting regular, unannounced inspections. After he left, Isla collapsed onto the couch, emotionally drained. "I hadn't considered that aspect, that people might think we're trying to turn a wild bear into a pet." "It's a valid concern, Doctor," Chen acknowledged. which is why documentation and scientific rigor are so important here. We're not trying to domesticate Rosie. We're providing temporary care while studying an unusual interspecies bond. Emma, who had been playing with Rosie in their supervised setting throughout the day, seemed oblivious to the complex ethical discussions swirling around her. To her, Rosie was simply a friend who needed care, not unlike the way she tended to her dolls and stuffed animals. As evening approached, bringing with it the gentle rhythms of their bedtime routine, Isla and Noah found themselves navigating new territory. How would they maintain Emma's existing schedule while accommodating Rosie's needs? The answer came naturally, as Emma insisted that Rosie be included in her bedtime story. Seated on Noah's lap in the rocking chair, Emma listened to "Goodnight Moon," while Rosie lay on a cushion at their feet, seemingly equally entranced by Noah's soothing voice. "Good night, stars, good night, air, good night, noises everywhere," Noah finished, closing the book. "Good night, Rosie," Emma added sleepily. As Noah tucked Emma into her crib, Isla gently guided Rosie to her enclosure, which had been lined with soft blankets and equipped with a few sturdy toys. "Good night, little one," she whispered, surprised by the tenderness she felt toward this wild creature who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. Later, lying in bed beside Noah, Isla whispered, "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Noah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but I do know that something remarkable is happening between Emma and Rosie. And maybe, just maybe, there's something important to be learned from it." Isla nodded in the darkness. "I keep thinking about what Dr. Chen said, about cross-species empathy. Emma doesn't see Rosie as a wild animal to be feared. She just sees someone who needs a friend." "The wisdom of children," Noah murmured, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. As Isla drifted off herself, she couldn't have known that in the coming days their isolated cabin would become the focal point of intense interest, both scientific and public, nor that their decision to foster Rosie would spark controversy far beyond their small mountain community. They also couldn't have foreseen how their relationships with each other and with the natural world would be profoundly transformed by the presence of one small bear cub, orphaned by chance and saved by compassion. In the quiet of the night, as the wind whispered through the surrounding forest, new bonds were forming, bonds that would challenge conventional wisdom about the divide between humans and wildlife, and ultimately tell a story of connection that would captivate hearts and minds across the country. The first week of their unusual arrangement passed in a blur of adjustments and discoveries. Dr. Chen visited daily, meticulously documenting the interactions between Emma and Rosie. Dr. Whitaker came every other day to check Rosie's health and monitor her growth. "She's gaining weight appropriately," Dr. Whitaker reported after weighing the cub, "and the wound on her paw has healed nicely." What fascinated everyone most was the evolving communication between Emma and Rosie. They had developed a sort of language, a combination of sounds, gestures, and expressions that only they seemed to fully understand. "Emma puffed cheeks, Rosie puffed cheeks," Noah explained to Dr. Chen one afternoon, as they watched the two playing on the living room rug. "Emma pat head, Rosie rolls over. It's like they've created their own secret code." Dr. Chen nodded, making notes. Children and young animals often develop paralanguage, communication that exists alongside, or instead of, verbal language. The remarkable thing here is how reciprocal it is. Isla, who had been initially the more hesitant of the parents, found herself increasingly drawn into the wonder of the situation. She began keeping her own journal, recording observations that the scientific data might miss. The way Emma's face lit up when Rosie successfully mimicked a new sound, or how the cub seemed to hover protectively near Emma when unfamiliar visitors arrived. The promised confidentiality proved short-lived, however. Despite their best efforts to maintain privacy, rumors began spreading through their small mountain community. It started with the carpenter who had helped modify their home, then extended to the delivery person who wondered why they suddenly needed such large quantities of specialized food. By the end of the second week, a local newspaper reporter was calling persistently, asking for confirmation of the story about the little girl and her bear cub. "We should have anticipated this," Noah said, deleting yet another voicemail message from the reporter. "People talk." Dr. Chen seemed more resigned than surprised. It was always a possibility. Perhaps it's better to control the narrative than have speculation run wild. This led to a carefully orchestrated interview with strict limitations. The reporter, Shannon Davies from the Mountain Valley Gazette, was allowed to observe Emma and Rosie for 30 minutes, with Dr. Chen present to explain the scientific nature of the arrangement and emphasize the safety protocols in place. The article that followed was thoughtful and measured, but it caught the attention of larger news outlets. By the end of the third week, the Marshall family's phone was ringing constantly, and unfamiliar cars occasionally drove slowly past their cabin, hoping for a glimpse of the unusual pair. "This is getting out of hand," Isla worried, pulling the curtains closed as another car crawled by. "I don't want Emma or Rosie turned into some kind of sideshow attraction." The pressure intensified when a prominent wildlife conservation group issued a statement condemning the arrangement, calling it dangerous and misguided, and demanding that the cub be immediately transferred to a traditional rehabilitation facility. Dr. Chen responded with his own statement, backed by a growing body of data from his observations. "What we are witnessing is not an attempt to domesticate a wild animal, but rather a unique opportunity to study interspecies cooperation and communication in a controlled environment. The protocols in place exceed standard safety requirements, and the ultimate goal remains the cub's successful transition to a natural habitat." The scientific community became divided on the issue, but I do know that something remarkable is happening between Emma and Rosie. And maybe, just maybe, there's something important to be learned from it. Isla nodded in the darkness. "I keep thinking about what Dr. Chen said, about cross-species empathy. Emma doesn't see Rosie as a wild animal to be feared. She just sees someone who needs a friend." "The wisdom of children," Noah murmured, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. As Isla drifted off herself, she couldn't have known that in the coming days their isolated cabin would become the focal point of intense interest, both scientific and public, nor that their decision to foster Rosie would spark controversy far beyond their small mountain community. They also couldn't have foreseen how their relationships with each other and with the natural world would be profoundly transformed by the presence of one small bear cub, orphaned by chance and saved by compassion. In the quiet of the night, as the wind whispered through the surrounding forest, new bonds were forming, bonds that would challenge conventional wisdom about the divide between humans and wildlife, and ultimately tell a story of connection that would captivate hearts and minds across the country. The first week of their unusual arrangement passed in a blur of adjustments and discoveries. Dr. Chen visited daily, meticulously documenting the interactions between Emma and Rosie. Dr. Whitaker came every other day to check Rosie's health and monitor her growth. "She's gaining weight appropriately," Dr. Whitaker reported after weighing the cub, "and the wound on her paw has healed nicely." What fascinated everyone most was the evolving communication between Emma and Rosie. They had developed a sort of language, a combination of sounds, gestures, and expressions that only they seemed to fully understand. "Emma puffed cheeks, Rosie puffed cheeks," Noah explained to Dr. Chen one afternoon, as they watched the two playing on the living room rug. Emma Pathead, Rosie rolls over. It's like they've created their own secret code. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes. Children and young animals often develop paralanguage, communication that exists alongside, or instead of, verbal language. The remarkable thing here is how reciprocal it is. Isla, who had been initially the more hesitant of the parents, found herself increasingly drawn into the wonder of the situation. She began keeping her own journal, recording observations that the scientific data might miss. The way Emma's face lit up when Rosie successfully mimicked a new sound, or how the cub seemed to hover protectively near Emma when unfamiliar visitors arrived. The promised confidentiality proved short-lived, however. Despite their best efforts to maintain privacy, rumors began spreading through their small mountain community. It started with the carpenter who had helped modify their home, then extended to the delivery person who wondered why they suddenly needed such large quantities of specialized food. By the end of the second week, a local newspaper reporter was calling persistently, asking for confirmation of the story about the little girl and her bear cub. "We should have anticipated this," Noah said, deleting yet another voicemail message from the reporter. People talk. Dr. Chen seemed more resigned than surprised. It was always a possibility. Perhaps it's better to control the narrative than have speculation run wild. This led to a carefully orchestrated interview with strict limitations. The reporter, Shannon Davies from the Mountain Valley Gazette, was allowed to observe Emma and Rosie for 30 minutes, with Dr. Chen present to explain the scientific nature of the arrangement and emphasize the safety protocols in place. The article that followed was thoughtful and measured, but it caught the attention of larger news outlets. By the end of the third week, the Marshall family's phone was ringing constantly, and unfamiliar cars occasionally drove slowly past their cabin, hoping for a glimpse of the unusual pair. "This is getting out of hand," Isla worried, pulling the curtains closed as another car crawled by. "I don't want Emma or Rosie turned into some kind of sideshow attraction." The pressure intensified when a prominent wildlife conservation group issued a statement condemning the arrangement, calling it dangerous and misguided, and demanding that the cub be immediately transferred to a traditional rehabilitation facility. Dr. Chen responded with his own statement, backed by a growing body of data from his observations. "What we are witnessing is not an attempt to domesticate a wild animal, but rather a unique opportunity to study interspecies cooperation and communication in a controlled environment. The protocols in place exceed standard safety requirements, and the ultimate goal remains the cub's successful transition to a natural habitat." The scientific community became divided on the issue. Some researchers supported Dr. Chen's approach, intrigued by the unusual bond and the potential insights it might provide. Others sided with the conservation group, arguing that any prolonged human contact would compromise the cub's future ability to live as a wild bear. Amidst this growing controversy, life inside the cabin maintained its own rhythm. Emma and Rosie continued their play sessions, oblivious to the debate swirling around them. The cub was growing rapidly, already noticeably larger than when she had first appeared in Emma's crib. One morning, as Isla supervised their interaction in the outdoor enclosure, she noticed something that made her call for Noah. Rosie had discovered a small beetle crawling through the grass, and, instead of immediately eating it as might be expected, she had gently nudged it toward Emma, as if showing her a new discovery. Emma responded with delight, leaning down to observe the beetle but not touching it. Then, to Isla's amazement, Emma led Rosie to another part of the enclosure where a different insect was climbing a plant stem. It was as if she was returning the favor, showing Rosie her own discovery. "They're teaching each other," Noah said softly, watching the exchange. This observation, when shared with Dr. Chen, generated particular excitement. This type of reciprocal teaching behavior is extraordinarily rare between different species, he explained. It suggests a level of cognitive connection that goes beyond simple mimicry or play. But as the scientific interest in Emma and Rosie's relationship deepened, so did the public controversy. The local wildlife officer, who had been conducting his promised inspections, reported increasing pressure from his superiors to end the arrangement. "It's becoming a political issue," he warned Noah during one visit. "My boss is getting calls from state officials who are getting calls from donor groups." The situation reached a tipping point when a small but vocal group of protesters appeared at the end of the marshal's driveway one Saturday morning, carrying signs with messages like, "Wild animals belong in the wild," and "Not a pet, not a science project." Officer Jameson arrived shortly after, looking grim. "I'm sorry about this," he said, gesturing toward the protesters. "I can ask them to move to the main road, but they have a right to peaceful protest." Ela felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. What had begun as an extraordinary circumstance, a lost, injured cub finding safety with their family, had morphed into something unrecognizable, a public spectacle that threatened the very peace and security they had sought to provide. That night, after Emma was asleep and Rosie settled in her enclosure, Noah and Isla sat at their kitchen table with Dr. Chen and Dr. Whitaker, facing a difficult decision. "The sanctuary in Montana has agreed to take her," Dr. Whitaker said quietly. "They have experience with cubs that have had human contact. She would have space to grow and develop naturally, with minimal human interaction." Dr. Chen nodded. "I believe we've gathered enough preliminary data to justify continuing our research there, if they're amenable. We could document the transition process." Noah looked at Isla, who was staring down at her hands. "What about Emma?" he asked, voicing the question that weighed most heavily on both their hearts. No one had a good answer. How do you explain to a 2-year-old that her beloved friend, a friend who had become an integral part of her daily life, had to go away? How do you help her understand concepts like wildlife rehabilitation and natural habitat when her worldview was still forming? As they debated different approaches, a crash of thunder rattled the windows, eerily reminiscent of the night they had made their original decision to foster Rosie. Almost immediately, they heard Emma's frightened cry, followed by Rosie's answering whimper. Noah and Isla hurried to Emma's room to find a scene that broke their hearts. Emma had once again climbed out of her crib and was pressing against Rosie's enclosure. The cub was equally distressed, pawing at the barrier between them as lightning flashed outside the window. "Bear, hug!" Emma pleaded, looking up at her parents with tears streaming down her face. Rosie scared. In that moment, watching their daughter's instinctive empathy for another creature's fear, Isla and Noah recognized that whatever decision they made would have lasting implications, not just for Rosie's future, but for the kind of person Emma would become. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the cabin as if echoing the emotional turmoil within. But in the midst of this chaos, a new resolution was forming, one that would take their story in an unexpected direction and challenge conventional wisdom about the relationships between humans and wildlife in ways no one could have anticipated. What happened next would indeed shock everyone who heard their story. A bold decision born of compassion, science, and a profound respect for the natural world, one that would redefine their understanding of family and forever change their place in the wilderness they called home. "I think I have an idea," Isla said, her voice soft but determined as she gazed at Emma and Rosie. "But it's going to require something radical from all of us. Dr. Chen and Dr. Whitaker exchanged curious glances while Noah studied his wife's face, recognizing the expression she wore when her mind was made up about something. Instead of sending Rosie away to the sanctuary, Isla continued, "What if we bring the sanctuary to her, to us?" For a moment, there was only the sound of rain pounding against the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. "I'm not sure I follow," Dr. Whitaker said carefully. Isla took a deep breath and outlined her vision. The Marshalls owned not just their cabin, but 5 surrounding acres of woodland. What if they were to convert their property into a small, specialized wildlife rehabilitation center, starting with Rosie, but potentially expanding to help other orphaned bear cubs in the future? "We already have the beginnings of the necessary facilities," she pointed out. "The outdoor enclosure could be expanded, made more natural. We could create a gradual transition program where human contact is slowly reduced as the animals mature." Noah looked stunned. "Isla, that would change our entire lives." "Our lives have already changed," she replied simply, gesturing toward Emma and Rosie, who had calmed each other during the storm and were now dozing off together, the toddler's hand resting gently on the cub's head. Dr. Chen was already deep in thought, his scientific mind racing with possibilities. It's unprecedented, but not entirely implausible. There are successful examples of in situ rehabilitation, programs where animals are prepared for wild release in or near their natural habitat. But the expertise required, the permits, the funding. Dr. Whitaker began, though Isla could see a spark of interest in her eyes. "I've been researching wildlife rehabilitation since Rosie arrived," Isla admitted. "I have a background in education that I've never fully utilized since moving here, and Noah has construction experience. With your guidance, Doctor Whitaker, and the scientific framework Dr. Chen could provide." The conversation continued late into the night, fluctuating between practical challenges and inspired possibilities. By morning, what had begun as a desperate solution to an immediate problem had evolved into something more visionary: the Marshall Wildlife Bridge, a rehabilitation center designed specifically for orphaned bear cubs, with a research component focused on interspecies empathy and communication. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Chen leveraged his university connections to secure initial funding for research, while Dr. Whitaker helped navigate the complex permitting process. Noah began drawing up plans for expanded facilities that would allow rescued cubs to develop natural behaviors with minimal human imprinting. Isla, whose previous work as an elementary school teacher had been set aside when they moved to the mountains, found herself developing educational materials for limited, controlled visits that would eventually be part of the center's conservation mission. The protesters, initially skeptical, became divided as the Marshals' plan became more widely understood. Some remained opposed to any human intervention with wildlife, but others were intrigued by the innovative approach being proposed. "It's not about domestication," Noah explained patiently during a community meeting that had been organized to address concerns. "It's about creating a bridge back to the wild for animals that would otherwise have no chance of survival." The most remarkable transformation, however, was happening within their own home. As plans for the rehabilitation center progressed, Rosie continued to grow and develop, both physically and in her interactions with Emma. By the 4th month of her stay, Rosie had nearly tripled in size. She was now too large to safely play with Emma indoors, so their supervised interactions took place in the expanded outdoor enclosure. Yet, despite her increasing physical power, Rosie maintained an extraordinary gentleness around the toddler. "It defies conventional understanding of bear behavior," Dr. Chen remarked one afternoon, reviewing footage of Emma showing Rosie how to splash in a small wading pool they had set up. She's demonstrating something akin to theory of mind, an awareness that Emma is more fragile than she is. This observation became part of a growing body of data that Dr. Chen was collecting, which was beginning to draw positive attention from the scientific community. A prestigious journal had expressed interest in publishing his preliminary findings, and several graduate students from the university had begun assisting with the documentation. As summer turned to fall, a new challenge emerged. The timeline for completing the rehabilitation center's expanded facilities had been extended due to permit delays, but Rosie's natural development wouldn't wait for bureaucratic processes. Bears in the wild would be preparing for winter dormancy, and despite her unusual upbringing, Rosie was showing instinctual behaviors associated with this preparation. She needs to learn how to create a den and prepare for winter, Dr. Whitaker explained during one of her now weekly visits. It's a crucial developmental stage that we can't suppress. This led to yet another innovative solution. Under Dr. Whitaker's guidance, they sectioned off a portion of the property where Rosie could begin practicing natural denning behaviors with minimal human interference, but continued monitoring. The separation was harder on Emma than anyone had anticipated. Despite careful explanations appropriate for her age, she couldn't understand why her daily play sessions with Rosie were being reduced. Rosie sleep time, Noah tried to explain one crisp October morning as Emma stood at the window, watching the bear cub explore her new, more naturalistic space. Emma sleep with Rosie, she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. No, sweetheart, Isla said gently. Rosie needs to learn to be a bear. Remember how we talked about this? She'll sleep in her special bear house for the winter. Emma's lower lip trembled. Rosie forget Emma? The question broke Isla's heart. No, sweet girl. Rosie won't forget you. She's just growing up like you are. The transition wasn't easy for Rosie either. The cub had become accustomed to human presence and comfort, particularly Emma's. During the first few days in her new semi-wild space, she would often return to the edge nearest the cabin, looking expectantly toward the house as if waiting for her small human friend to appear. Dr. Chen documented this period meticulously, noting that it represented a critical phase in the rehabilitation process, the gradual shifting of Rosie's social bonds from humans back to her natural state. If we can successfully navigate this transition, he explained, it could provide a model for future rehabilitation efforts. The approach of winter brought new activity to the developing center. 2 additional structures were completed: a medical examination area where Dr. Whitaker could treat future rescue cases, and a small educational building where limited, controlled observations could eventually take place. Interest in the project had spread beyond their local community. A documentary filmmaker had approached them about chronicling the first year of the center's development, and a children's book author had requested permission to create a story inspired by Emma and Rosie's unusual friendship. Through it all, the Marshalls worked to maintain as normal a life as possible for Emma, whose vocabulary was expanding rapidly. Rosie hibernating, she would inform visitors seriously. She sleep all winter and grow big and strong. The first snow came in late November, blanketing the woods in pristine white. Through the monitoring cameras, they watched as Rosie, now looking much more like a proper bear cub than the small, vulnerable creature that had appeared in Emma's crib, completed her winter den, a shallow cave reinforced with branches and lined with leaves and grass she had gathered herself. This is a very good sign, Dr. Whitaker said, reviewing the footage. She's demonstrating appropriate natural behaviors despite her unusual early experiences. The day Rosie entered her den for winter dormancy was bittersweet for the Marshall family. They had known this milestone was coming, had prepared for it, and recognized its importance in Rosie's development, but the absence of her active presence created a palpable emptiness. Emma insisted on recording a good-night message that Dr. Chen reluctantly allowed to be played once near Rosie's den before her dormancy deepened. "Night-night, Rosie." Emma's small voice echoed in the winter stillness. "Emma, love you. See you in spring." Whether it was coincidence or recognition, the monitoring cameras captured Rosie lifting her head briefly at the sound of Emma's voice before settling deeper into her den. Winter brought its own rhythm to the Marshall household. The rehabilitation center construction continued as weather permitted, and Isla devoted herself to developing educational materials and protocols for the limited public engagement they planned to allow once the center was fully operational. Noah, whose construction business had been largely set aside during the intensive development phase, found himself becoming increasingly invested in the center's mission. He began studying wildlife management and taking online courses in rehabilitation techniques, determined to be more than just the builder of the physical structures. Emma, now approaching her 3rd birthday, maintained her connection to Rosie through ritualistic check-ins, where she would stand at the edge of the natural enclosure, sometimes leaving small presents, pine cones or interesting rocks, that Isla would later remove to maintain the proper wild environment. "Remember, Emma," Noah would remind her, "we're helping Rosie learn to be a wild bear. That means we watch and learn, but we don't interfere too much." Emma seemed to grasp this concept with surprising maturity for her age, Rosie growing up. She would say solemnly, "Emma, too." The winter passed slowly, marked by holiday celebrations, occasional visits from Dr. Chen and Dr. Whitaker, and ongoing work on the center. The documentary film crew came and went, capturing the development of the facilities and interviewing the Marshalls about their unconventional journey. By February, anticipation was building for Rosie's emergence from hibernation. The monitoring cameras showed occasional movement within the den, suggesting that her dormancy was not as deep as it would be for an adult bear, normal for a cub her age. Bears her age in the wild would still be with their mothers, Dr. Whitaker explained. The mother would be encouraging movement and even some feeding during warmer winter days. We'll need to monitor her carefully during this transition period. The first truly warm day came in early March, one of those false spring days that breaks through the winter chill with unexpected warmth. The thermal cameras showed Rosie becoming more active, and by mid-morning she had ventured to the entrance of her den, blinking in the bright sunlight. Emma, who had been watching the live feed with nearly obsessive attention for weeks, squealed with delight. "Rosie, wake up! Rosie, wake up!" The bear that emerged from the den was significantly larger than the one that had entered it months before. Even with minimal feeding during dormancy, Rosie had continued to grow, her frame filling out in preparation for her next developmental stage. She moved with a cautious curiosity, exploring her enclosure as if seeing it for the first time. When she approached the edge nearest the cabin, Emma could no longer contain her excitement. "Can I see her? Please, please," she begged, tugging at Isla's hand. After consulting with Dr. Chen, who was already on his way to observe this critical transition, they agreed to a brief, controlled visit. They would remain at a safe distance, allowing Rosie to choose whether to approach or not. Bundled in her winter coat, Emma stood between her parents at the observation area they had constructed, a small platform at the edge of the enclosure that allowed visibility while maintaining appropriate separation. "Rosie!" Emma called, her voice carrying in the clear mountain air. "Emma here!" The bear's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She turned toward the sound, her nose lifted to catch Emma's scent on the breeze. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, as if processing this remembered connection. Then, to everyone's amazement, Rosie made a soft huffing sound. the same vocalization she and Emma had exchanged during their play sessions months earlier. Without prompting, Emma responded with the same sound, a perfect mimicry of bear communication that she had somehow retained through the winter. "Extraordinary," Dr. Chen murmured, having arrived just in time to witness the exchange. This suggests long-term memory of their communication system. Rosie approached the edge of the enclosure, moving with the fluid grace of a growing predator, but maintaining the gentle demeanor that had characterized her interactions with Emma. She sat on her haunches about 10 feet from the observation area, studying the humans with intelligent eyes. "She recognizes us," Noah said softly. "But there's something different now, more bear-like." Isla nodded. "She's finding her true nature." This delicate balance, Rosie's emerging wild identity alongside her established human connections, would become the defining characteristic of the Marshall Wildlife Bridges approach. Over the coming weeks, as spring truly arrived and the center prepared for possible additional rescues, Rosie's rehabilitation continued with careful management of human contact. Emma was allowed supervised visits with increasingly structured protocols. These sessions were now framed as research rather than play, with Emma learning to observe and document Rosie's behaviors in her own simple way, drawing pictures of what Rosie ate and how she moved, creating a child's version of scientific field notes. "She's going to be a wildlife biologist," Noah joked, as Emma solemnly recorded in her crayon notebook that Rosie liked berries best. The official opening of the Marshall Wildlife Bridge Rehabilitation Center occurred in late April, marked by a small ceremony attended by local officials, the university research team that had now formally partnered with them, and a select group of wildlife conservation representatives. What began as an extraordinary circumstance, an orphaned cub seeking shelter and finding unexpected connection, has evolved into something with far-reaching implications, Dr. Chen said in his remarks. "This center represents a new paradigm in wildlife rehabilitation, one that acknowledges the complexity of human-animal relationships while respecting the ultimate goal of successful return to the wild." As if on cue, Rosie appeared at the edge of her now expansive natural enclosure, sitting calmly as she observed the gathering from a distance. She was now the size of a yearling bear, her baby features giving way to the more defined characteristics of adolescence. "By next spring, she'll be ready for the final phase of rehabilitation," Dr. Whitaker explained to the assembled guests. "We'll transition her to the larger wilderness enclosure being constructed on the adjacent state forest land, where she'll have minimal human contact for several months before full release." The thought of Rosie's eventual complete return to the wild created complicated emotions for the Marshall family. They had always known this was the goal, had designed the entire program around this outcome, but the reality of it was still difficult to contemplate. That evening, after the guests had departed and the center was quiet once more, the family sat on their porch, watching as the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Emma had fallen asleep in Isla's lap, exhausted from the excitement of the day. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if she hadn't climbed through Emma's window that night?" Noah asked, his voice soft in the gathering twilight. Isla stroked their daughter's hair thoughtfully. "She probably wouldn't have survived, and we would never have discovered all of this." She gestured toward the rehabilitation center buildings, now barely visible in the fading light. "It's strange to think that something so unexpected, so potentially dangerous could lead to something so meaningful," Noah mused. "Life rarely follows the path we expect," Isla replied. "Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unlikely places." As darkness settled over the mountain, Rosie could be seen moving through her enclosure, her form a shadowy silhouette against the deeper darkness of the forest. She paused, looking toward the cabin where the family sat, as if sensing their gaze upon her. In that moment, suspended between day and night, between wild and tame, between what was and what would be, a deeper truth revealed itself, that the boundaries we create between species, between nature and humanity, are perhaps more permeable than we imagine. That connection can transcend these artificial divides, creating bridges where walls once stood. The Marshall Wildlife Bridge would go on to rescue and rehabilitate 12 more orphaned bear cubs over the next 2 years, each with their own story, their own journey back to the wild. But none would ever quite match the extraordinary bond that had formed between a toddler and the cub who had climbed through her window on a cold spring night. And Rosie? Her story would continue to unfold in ways that would challenge scientific understanding and touch hearts around the world. But that is a tale for another time. A tale of a bear who carried the memory of human kindness into the wilderness, creating ripples of connection that would extend far beyond the mountains that had witnessed the beginning of this remarkable journey. Summer arrived with an explosion of green life throughout the mountain forest. The Marshall Wildlife Bridge had settled into its operational rhythm, with Dr. Whitaker making weekly visits to oversee the medical aspects of rehabilitation, and Dr. Chen continuing his research with a team that now included 3 graduate students. Rosie was thriving in her expanded enclosure, which had been designed to mimic the natural environment she would eventually inhabit fully. At 15 months old, she was rapidly developing the skills she would need for independent survival. Foraging for berries and plants, fishing in the small stream that had been incorporated into her space, and even practicing limited hunting behaviors with specially designed training mechanisms. The most remarkable aspect of her development, however, remained her retained connection with Emma, now 3 years old, and increasingly verbal about her relationship with my bear friend. Their interactions were now carefully structured as part of Dr. Chen's research protocol, twice weekly observation sessions of limited duration, always with multiple safety measures in place. These sessions had evolved from play to a more naturalistic observation format, with Emma learning to watch and record Rosie's behaviors from a safe distance. "What Rosie doing today?" Noah would ask as Emma diligently drew in her research notebook with colorful crayons. "She fishing," Emma would reply, carefully drawing blue squiggles for water and a brown bear shape with a fish in its mouth. "She very good catcher." These sessions provided valuable data for Dr. Chen's ongoing study of interspecies communication and the retention of learned behaviors in bears. But they also served another purpose, gradually preparing both Emma and Rosie for their inevitable separation when Rosie would be fully released into the wild. The transition needs to be as gentle as possible for both of them, Dr. Chen explained during one of the weekly team meetings. Emma is forming important developmental understandings about relationships and loss, while Rosie is navigating the complex territory between her wild instincts and her learned comfort with human presence. In late June, an unexpected event accelerated this transition process. A severe thunderstorm swept through the mountains, bringing with it lightning that sparked a forest fire several miles from the Marshall property. Though they were not in immediate danger, the smoke and distant glow of flames created a palpable sense of threat. Wildlife in the surrounding forest responded with natural alarm. Birds fell silent. Small mammals retreated to burrows, and the ambient sounds of the woods were replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional distant crack of falling timber. Rosie's reaction was immediate and instinctive. She became agitated, pacing her enclosure and vocalizing in ways they hadn't heard before, deep, rumbling sounds that emanated from her chest and carried on the smoke-tinged air. She's demonstrating natural fear responses, Dr. Chen observed as they monitored her behavior from the cabin. This is actually a positive sign from a rehabilitation perspective. She's responding to environmental threats as a wild bear would. Emma, watching Rosie's distress on the monitoring screen, became upset herself. "Rosie, scared," she insisted, pressing her small hands against the screen. "Need to help." Explaining to a 3-year-old that Rosie's fear was natural and even necessary for her development as a wild bear proved challenging. Emma had been raised with the concept of helping those in distress, of offering comfort to friends who were frightened or hurt. The idea that Rosie now needed to learn to manage threat responses independently seemed to contradict these important early lessons in empathy. Sometimes helping means letting someone figure things out on their own, Isla tried to explain, holding Emma on her lap as they watched Rosie finally settle into a sheltered corner of her enclosure. Rosie is learning to be brave by herself. That's how bears stay safe in the forest. Emma considered this with the serious concentration that children sometimes bring to difficult concepts. "Emma brave too," she finally declared. "Emma help Rosie be brave." This moment marked a subtle but significant shift in how Emma conceptualized her relationship with Rosie. From playmate to something more complex, a connection that included supporting independence rather than just shared experiences. The forest fire was contained within 3 days, never approaching close enough to require evacuation of the rehabilitation center. But its impact lingered in other ways. Rosie's behavior had noticeably changed, her movements more purposeful, her interaction with humans more limited and cautious. The environmental threat it triggered accelerated wild behavior development, Dr. Chen noted in his research log. She's demonstrating increased territorial awareness and self-preservation instincts. For the marshals, particularly Isla, these changes brought mixed emotions. Pride in Rosie's healthy development toward eventual release was tempered by the undeniable sense of growing distance. The bear they had rescued and nurtured was increasingly becoming a wild animal, as she was always meant to be. "It's what we wanted," Isla confessed to Noah late one night as they sat on their porch, watching the moon rise over the mountains. "It's what we designed this whole program for. So why does it feel like we're losing something precious?" Noah took her hand, understanding without need for further explanation. "Because we are losing something. Not in a bad way, but in the way that all meaningful relationships evolve and change. Emma will grow up and become more independent too. That's the price of loving well. You have to let go." July brought new developments to the Marshall Wildlife Bridge. 2 more orphaned bear cubs were rescued from a site nearly 50 miles away, victims of a mother bear killed by a car on the increasingly busy mountain highways. These cubs, both male and significantly younger than Rosie had been when she arrived, were housed in a separate facility specifically designed for early rehabilitation. "We won't encourage the same type of human bonding that occurred with Rosie," Dr. Whitaker explained as they prepared for the new arrivals. "That was a unique circumstance. These cubs will have more traditional rehabilitation protocols." The arrival of new cubs shifted some of the center's energy and attention, creating a natural opportunity for Rosie's continued transition toward independence. Her enclosure was expanded yet again, now connecting directly to the larger pre-release habitat that had been constructed on the adjacent state forest land. Emma, showing remarkable adaptability, transferred some of her caretaking interest to the new cubs, whom she was allowed to observe through one-way glass but not interact with directly. "Baby bears need mama," she explained seriously to one of Dr. Chen's graduate students who had asked about her drawings of the new cubs. "Rosie, big bear now. Baby's small." This developmental milestone, Emma's growing understanding of different needs at different life stages delighted both her parents and the research team. She was demonstrating sophisticated cognitive mapping of relationships and care requirements, concepts that many children much older than her struggled to grasp. As August approached, bringing with it the hottest days of the summer, preparations began for the next major step in Rosie's rehabilitation. The connecting gate between her familiar enclosure and the much larger pre-release habitat would be opened, allowing her to explore this more wild territory while still maintaining access to her known safe space. This is a critical juncture, Dr. Chen emphasized during the planning meeting. We want to encourage exploration while providing security. The data suggests that rehabilitated bears who are rushed into full wild conditions without this intermediate step have lower survival rates. The day the gate was scheduled to open, a small team gathered at the observation blind constructed at the edge of the pre-release habitat. Noah and Isla were there, along with Dr. Chen and 2 of his students. Emma, after careful consideration, had been included as well, with the understanding that she would remain absolutely quiet during the observation. "Remember, sweetheart," Noah whispered as they settled into the blind, "today we're just watching." Like real scientists. Emma nodded solemnly, her favorite stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. "Watching Rosie explore," she whispered back. The gate mechanism had been designed to open slowly and quietly, minimizing any startling effect. As it began to rise, Rosie appeared at the far end of her familiar enclosure, alerted by the subtle change in her environment. She approached cautiously, her powerful nose testing the air currents flowing in from the new space. The pre-release habitat extended nearly 50 acres into the state forest, filled with natural food sources, varied terrain, and the kinds of challenges Rosie would face upon full release. For nearly 20 minutes, she simply investigated the open gateway, occasionally stepping forward before retreating to more familiar ground. The observers remained perfectly still, recording her behavior but not interfering in any way. Then, with a suddenness that caught them all by surprise, Rosie made her decision. She moved through the gateway with purpose, her powerful body carrying her swiftly into the new territory. Within moments, she had disappeared into the underbrush, though they knew she was being tracked by the unobtrusive monitoring device that had been attached to her ear. "She's exploring the stream corridor," Dr. Chen reported softly, looking at the tracking data on his tablet. "Moving steadily but not rushing. This is ideal behavior." Emma watched the screen with wide eyes, seeing the blinking dot that represented Rosie moving through the digital map of the habitat. "Rosie Adventure," she whispered, excitement and a touch of wistfulness in her small voice. The day extended into a long vigil, with team members rotating in and out of the blind to maintain constant observation without overcrowding the small space. Rosie ranged widely through her new territory, investigating water sources, foraging opportunities, and potential denning sites. By late afternoon, the tracking data showed her returning toward the gateway. As dusk approached, she reappeared at the edge of the familiar enclosure looking somehow different, more alert, more present in her body, more bare. "She's coming back to what's known before, fully committing to the new space," Dr. Whitaker observed, having joined them for this final observation of the day. That's typical behavior and suggests a healthy approach to exploration. As darkness fell and the observation team prepared to depart, Rosie made a final move that none of them had anticipated. She approached the outer perimeter of the enclosure, the section nearest to the observation blind, and sat on her haunches looking directly toward them. Though the blind was designed to prevent animals from seeing the humans inside, Rosie's keen senses had clearly detected their presence. For several long moments she remained motionless, her gaze fixed on their location. Then, as if making a statement or offering a farewell, She rose on her hind legs to her full height. Now an impressive sight, before dropping back to all fours and moving definitively through the gateway into the pre-release habitat. "Did you see that?" one of the graduate students whispered excitedly. "It was almost like she was saying goodbye." Dr. Chen made a non-committal sound, ever the cautious scientist, but even he couldn't entirely dismiss the meaningfulness of the moment. As they walked back to the cabin in the gathering darkness, Emma was unusually quiet, processing the day's events in her own way. Finally, as they approached the porch, she looked up at her parents with solemn eyes. "Rosie, going to her house now," she said, "in the forest." "Yes, sweetheart," Isla replied gently. "But she can still come back to her old space if she wants to. She's just growing up." Emma nodded, accepting this explanation with the straightforward understanding that children sometimes bring to complex transitions. "Growing up is adventures," she declared. Noah squeezed her small hand. "Yes, it is. For bears and for little girls." That night, as the Marshall family settled into their bedtime routine, now expanded to include checking the tracking data for their rehabilitating bears, a new chapter in their extraordinary journey was beginning. Rosie was taking her first real steps toward the full wild life she was born for, carrying with her the resilience and trust that had been nurtured during her unusual upbringing. And Emma, too young to fully comprehend the scientific and conservation significance of what her family had created, understood the most important truth of all: that love sometimes means watching someone you care about walk bravely into their own adventure, even when that path leads them away from you. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the kind of perfect summer day that seemed to shimmer with possibility. Isla awoke early, drawn to the tracking screen before even making coffee. The blinking dot that represented Rosie showed her deep in the pre-release habitat, having spent her first night away from the familiar enclosure. "She stayed out there all night," she told Noah when he joined her, wiping sleep from his eyes. "No returns to the safe zone at all." Noah studied the screen, noting the pattern of Rosie's movements. "Looks like she found that rock outcropping we thought might make a good resting spot. Smart girl." The day unfolded with a new rhythm. Regular checks of the tracking data interspersed with the ongoing work of the rehabilitation center. The two younger cubs were adjusting well to their environment, showing healthy appetite and appropriate wariness around humans. Emma, who had awakened asking immediately about Rosie's adventure, was absorbed into this daily pattern, given small age-appropriate tasks related to the center's operation that helped her feel connected to the larger mission. "Emma help baby bears," she announced proudly as she carefully sorted clean towels for the medical area under Isla's supervision. By mid-afternoon, the tracking data showed Rosie returning toward the gateway between the habitats. The observation team quickly assembled, eager to document this first return. "This is textbook behavior for the transition phase," Dr. Chen explained as they settled into the blind. "Exploration, followed by return to the familiar for reassurance and rest. Each excursion typically extends farther and lasts longer until the new territory becomes the primary range." They watched as Rosie emerged from the underbrush, moving with the confident grace that had increasingly characterized her development. She paused at the gateway as if considering her options, then moved through into her original enclosure. Her behavior upon return was methodical. She drank from the familiar water source, investigated the feeding stations, though she didn't take the offered food, and performed a thorough inspection of the perimeter, as if reassuring herself that this known territory remained unchanged. "She's mapping both spaces mentally," Dr. Chen noted, building a comprehensive understanding of her expanding territory. What happened next surprised everyone. even the experienced researchers. After completing her inspection, Rosie approached the section of the enclosure nearest the main rehabilitation center buildings. She stood watching the structures for several minutes, her posture alert but relaxed. Then, to their astonishment, she made the distinctive huffing sound that had been part of her communication system with Emma months earlier, a sound they hadn't heard her make since before her winter dormancy. "Is she—" one of the graduate students began, but fell silent as the implication settled over the observation team. Dr. Chen's scientific reserve cracked slightly. "She appears to be attempting communication with her human associates," he acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral, despite the extraordinary nature of this behavior. Noah and Isla exchanged a look loaded with meaning. Without discussion, Noah slipped out of the blind and returned to the cabin, where Emma was having a supervised play session with one of the center's volunteers. When he explained what was happening, Emma's eyes grew wide. "Rosie calling? Emma can answer?" After a hurried consultation via phone with Dr. Whitaker, they agreed to a brief, strictly controlled interaction. Not direct contact, but an opportunity for Emma to respond to Rosie's apparent communication attempt from the safety of the designated observation area. When they returned to the enclosure, Rosie was still present, now lying in the dappled shade of a pine tree near the edge closest to the buildings. She rose immediately when the small group appeared at the observation platform, her attention focused and intent. "Remember, Emma," Noah instructed quietly, "we stay right here. Rosie is a wild bear now, even though she knows us." Emma nodded seriously, her small face solemn with the responsibility of the moment. Then, with perfect clarity, she made the huffing sound that had once been their shared language. Rosie's response was immediate. She huffed back, adding a soft chuffing sound that they had documented during their earlier play sessions. Then, in a display that left even Dr. Chen momentarily speechless, she sat back on her haunches and raised one paw in a gesture remarkably similar to the wave that Emma had taught her months earlier. "She remembers," Isla whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. Emma, delighted by this recognition, waved back enthusiastically. "Hello, Rosie." "Emma, see your adventure," she called, her high, clear voice carrying easily across the distance between them. For nearly 10 minutes, this unusual reunion continued. Not the direct physical interaction of their earlier relationship, but a new kind of connection maintained across the necessary separation that Rosie's development required. She responded to Emma's voice with attention and recognition, occasionally making vocalizations that seemed directly related to their shared history. Finally, as if having satisfied some need for reconnection, Rosie rose and moved with purpose back toward the gateway, disappearing once more into the larger habitat beyond. That was... Dr. Chen seemed to struggle for scientific terminology adequate to describe what they had witnessed. Remarkable. The long-term retention of learned communication and recognition despite significant developmental changes and reduced contact. But Emma, with a child's ability to cut through complexity to essential truth, expressed it more simply as they walked back to the cabin. "Rosie, still my friend," she declared confidently. "Just a wild friend now." This pattern, Rosie's independent exploration of the pre-release habitat, interspersed with periodic returns to the familiar enclosure, continued through August and into September. Each return showed her increasing confidence and capability, while each departure extended longer as she established her place in the wilder territory. The Marshall Wildlife Bridge was evolving as well. The successful integration of the two younger cubs into the rehabilitation program had drawn attention from wildlife officials in neighboring states. By early fall, they had received formal requests to consider accepting 3 more orphaned cubs before winter. We're becoming an actual functioning rehabilitation center, Noah remarked one evening as they reviewed the expansion plans. Not just Rosie's caretakers anymore. Isla nodded, studying the blueprints spread across their kitchen table. It's happening faster than I expected. Are we ready for this? The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of all the changes the past months had brought. Their lives had been transformed in ways neither could have imagined that fateful morning when they found a bear cub sleeping beside their daughter. Before Noah could answer, their phone rang. Dr. Whitaker calling with unexpected news that would add yet another layer of complexity to their evolving story. "We've identified Rosie's origin," she said without preamble when Noah put the call on speaker. "And it's complicated." According to Dr. Whitaker, tissue samples taken during Rosie's initial examination had been part of a broader wildlife genetic study. The results had finally come back, revealing that Rosie was not fully wild-born as they had assumed. She appeared to be the offspring of a rehabilitated female bear released 3 years earlier from a different facility nearly 100 miles away. "That explains her unusual comfort with humans," Dr. Chen commented when he joined them later that evening to discuss this revelation. Her mother would have had human contact during her rehabilitation and possibly passed along reduced fear responses. This new information sparked intense debate among the research team. If Rosie was second-generation rehabilitated, did that change their approach to her eventual release? Would she be more vulnerable in a fully wild environment? Or did it suggest that rehabilitated bears could successfully reproduce in the wild, an encouraging sign for conservation efforts? "We need more data," Dr. Chen concluded, his scientific mind already mapping out additional research protocols. This could be groundbreaking for understanding intergenerational effects of rehabilitation. For the Marshall family, however, this revelation had more personal implications. If Rosie's unusual behavior was partly explained by her heritage, it gave new meaning to the bond she had formed with Emma. Perhaps she had been primed by her own genetic history to seek human connection when separated from her mother. "It's like the universe conspired to bring her to us," Isla remarked that night as she and Noah lay in bed, processing the day's discoveries. "Of all the places she could have sought shelter." Noah squeezed her hand in the darkness. Or maybe it's simpler than that. A lost cub found warmth and safety where she could, and we were fortunate enough to be the ones who could help her. As October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the mountain forest, Rosie's behavior began to shift again. The tracking data showed her ranging more widely through the pre-release habitat, with returns to the familiar enclosure becoming less frequent. "She's establishing her winter territory," Dr. Whitaker explained during her weekly check-in. Bears her age in the wild would be separating from their mothers around now, finding their own ranges. This natural progression was bittersweet for the Marshall family, particularly Emma, who noticed the increasingly rare sightings of her bear friend. "Rosie busy?" she would ask, checking the tracking screen that had become part of their daily routine. "Yes, sweetheart," Isla would answer, pointing to the moving dot that represented Rosie exploring far corners of her expanded territory. "She's getting ready for winter, just like the squirrels we see gathering nuts." One crisp morning in mid-October, as frost glittered on the fallen leaves, the center received unexpected visitors. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to the main building, and 2 officials from the Federal Wildlife Management Agency stepped out, their expressions serious. "We're here to evaluate the Marshall Wildlife Bridge Program," the senior official, a stern-faced woman named Director Patricia Hargrove, announced. "There have been concerns raised about your methods." It soon became clear that a formal complaint had been filed by a traditional wildlife rehabilitation organization, challenging the scientific validity and ethical basis of the Marshall Program, particularly the controlled human contact that had been part of Rosie's rehabilitation. Traditional protocols exist for a reason, Director Hargrove stated as she reviewed their records in the center's office. Minimizing human imprinting is Conservation 101. Dr. Chen defended their approach with the passion of a scientist whose work was being questioned. With respect, Director, those protocols were developed decades ago, without the benefit of the data we've been collecting here. Our preliminary results suggest that controlled, structured human contact during rehabilitation may actually enhance certain survival behaviors, not diminish them. The evaluation team spent 3 days at the center, inspecting facilities, reviewing research protocols, and observing the rehabilitation process for the newer cubs. They paid particular attention to the tracking data for Rosie, questioning her readiness for eventual full release. During their final meeting, Director Hargrove delivered a troubling ultimatum. Your permits for continuing operation will be contingent on implementing standard isolation protocols for all new rescues. And as for the bear, currently in pre-release, Rosie, Noah interrupted, unable to hear her referred to so impersonally. Director Hargrove's expression tightened. As for the bear designated R1, our recommendation is immediate transfer to a secured wilderness release site at least 200 miles from human habitation. The implications were clear and devastating. Not only would their rehabilitation model be fundamentally altered moving forward, but Rosie would be removed from their care entirely, transported to a distant location and released without the gradual transition they had carefully designed. That would traumatize her, Dr. Whitaker argued. She's adapting well to increasing independence, but a sudden relocation could compromise everything we've accomplished. Your attachment to this animal is precisely the problem, Director Hargrove replied coldly. Rehabilitation isn't about building relationships. It's about restoring natural behaviors for survival in the wild. After the officials departed with promises to return in 2 weeks for their final decision, the Marshall family gathered with Dr. Chen and Dr. Whitaker in a somber emergency meeting. They can't just take her, Isla said, her voice tight with emotion. After everything we've done, everything we've learned. Dr. Chen looked unusually defeated. Unfortunately, they can. These agencies have broad authority when it comes to wildlife management. Noah, who had been quiet throughout much of the discussion, suddenly straightened. Wait, what if we could prove that our method works? That Rosie is developing appropriate wild behaviors despite, or even because of, the unique approach we've taken? How? Dr. Whitaker asked. We've shown them all our data. Data isn't enough, Noah replied, a plan forming in his mind. They need to see her in action, see her demonstrating natural behaviors in a real-world situation.